Welcome everyone to the final round of the 2019 Madison Cup. Before we begin, I'd like to offer some thank yous to folks who have made this tournament possible. First of all, to the audience. All too often, these public debates wind up being underattended and not given the sort of value that they deserve, and it means a lot to all of us that the members of our community here at James Madison University and Harrisonburg have been able to join us. I'd like to thank the debaters who have been working all day to make sure this event goes off without a hitch. Evelyn Miller, who will also be our timekeeper this evening, Joseph Conrad, Aubrey Smith, Ashley Harris, Danielle Kratowicz, and Gabrielle Richards, as well as Alec Bellis, who have all been working hard to make sure that the tournament runs smoothly. I'd also like to thank our very large collection of judges for the preliminary debates. We wouldn't be able to make this work without the help of volunteers like them. And I'd also like to thank the Madison Cup Committee, Kathy Clark, Mick Souders, Abe Goldberg, Liv Stevens, and Lindsay Shook for their work to make this event possible. I'd also like to thank the Arthur N. Roop Foundation for the generous grant that makes this one of the most unique debate tournaments in the country, namely because it features a cash prize to the winning schools and winning participants. I'll briefly explain the format of the debate. The first two speeches are going to be 4 minutes in length. They will be by alternating sides, so the affirmative side followed by the negative side. The subsequent speeches will be 5 minutes in length, with the second through fourth minutes being interruptible by speakers rising to be recognized. You'll notice that they've been coached to raise their hand to be recognized. This is a tradition that we borrow from the British parliamentarian approach. The reason why they do this is to show they don't have a knife. So if you think politics are contentious here today, it could get worse. The last two speeches will also be 4 minutes long and uninterrupted. Those of you in the audience who have ballots should please turn them in at the end of the debate. And if you're doing it for the course credit, the SONA credits, make sure that the entries that you've selected as winners are not like Mickey Mouse. If you do that, your ballot won't be counted and you won't get credit. After the debates have been concluded, there will be a brief period where folks are going to be able to give floor speeches, so audience members will be able to respond to the arguments that have been made, and there will be a prize for the best floor speech that is given. The last thing that I'd like to do is introduce our final round judges. First, of course, who's already been well introduced, Keith Brechtelsbauer, the Global Commercial Director at Tredegar Corporation and a former James Madison University debater. Heather Coltman, the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at James Madison University. Salvador Romero, a graduate of James Madison University and the Vice Mayor of the City of Harrisonburg. And Edna Reed, Professor of Intelligence Analysis at James Madison University. The last folks I'm going to introduce to you here, Evelyn Miller, who will be our timekeeper this evening and has been duly given a gavel to make sure we all stay in line. And then I'll introduce the schools that are going to be competing. On the affirmative side here, we have Louisiana State University at Shreveport, We have Drury University and Georgetown University. Negating the resolution today, we have Liberty University, the University of Arkansas, and George Washington University. Without any further ado, we'll have our first speaker.
All right, so to kick things off, the very first thing I want to do is thank everyone at LSUS, Louisiana State University Shreveport, that made this trip possible, each of the organizations that donated to help us get the funds to get here and have this opportunity to talk about such a such a topic that needs to be talked about. But even further, I want to thank the LSUS debate team, which basically puts us where we are, gives us all of the practices we need every day to be where we are. And then the last person I want to thank is our Chancellor, Dr. Clark, who amazingly supports the LSUS debate team. We couldn't be where we are without him. So without that, let's actually get to what you all are here for, some debate. John F. Kennedy once said, "Everywhere immigrants have enriched and strengthened the fabric of American life." With this in mind, this leads us to the resolution: the United States federal government should significantly reduce executive authority on immigration. In January 2017, President Trump banned nationals of 7 majority Muslim countries from receiving visas or entering the United States. He followed up that ban with 2 subsequent bans, and as of April 10, 2019, the United States government is still blocking most legal admission from 5 majority Muslim nations. To win at the Supreme Court level, the president relied on Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationalities Act, which grants the president near limitless authority to suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens if he determines that they will be detrimental to the United States. So this leads us to our advocacy for the plan of the No Ban Act. According to the Cato Institute, April 10, 2019, the National Origin-Based Anti-Discrimination for Non-Immigrant Act, or No Ban Act, would explicitly protect the normal immigration system from this type of executive overreach. It would ban religious or nationally based discrimination from decisions about granting visas or immigration privileges and remove the president's authority to ban immigrants not explicitly authorized to be banned by Congress except in very narrow circumstances. The No Ban Act would do the following. First, it would amend Section 202A of the Immigration and Nationalities Act to clarify that this provision would guard against discrimination in decisions governing entry or other immigrant decisions, including for non-immigrants, temporary visas, tourists, guest workers, students, etc. 2, it would amend Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act to allow the president to ban aliens only if the ban is, first, based on credible facts that the entry should be restricted to address specific acts that undermine security, public safety, human rights, democratic processes, institutions, or international stability. Second, not based on religion or nationality, which prevents large-scale racism in bans or marginalization. Third, narrowly tailored to meet a compelling governmental interest. Fourth, uses the least restrictive means possible to achieve the governmental interest. Fifth, for a specific duration of time. And sixth, applies exemptions in favor of granting family-based and humanitarian-type waivers. So with the plan text in mind, this brings me to my first contention: the economic impacts. The Council of Foreign Relations in 2016 argues that executive overreach like the Muslim ban could cost the United States billions. A comprehensive ban would also have far-reaching negative economic consequences for the United States, particularly in travel, tourism, and education. A targeted ban on foreign visitors from these countries with significant Muslim populations would also have consequences well beyond the direct effects on travelers. It would hurt the economies of communities dependent on tourism. A ban on these travelers would also spill over to the federal, state, and local budgets via decreased tax revenues, and depending on how other nations react, could have still broader consequences for travel, trade, and investment. The direct loss of spending due to the Muslim travel ban would cost $14 billion to $30 billion per year, and the indirect spending is double that. The Council of Foreign Relationships in 2016 further cites that this ban would create a brain drain on some of the United States' most crucial industries, basically taking the technologies away from those areas. The estimated loss to education spending is about $4.6 billion. The cost includes the loss to graduate student researchers in the science and weakened foreign investment as foreign business travelers face new hurdles in reaching the United States. Contention number 2. Curtailing marginalization. The Cato Institute, April 10, 2019, says the current ban marginalizes millions, some of which never lived in the targeted areas. The president can take the Supreme Court decision as authorizing open season on all legal immigrants. The president quickly expanded this to include asylum seekers already in the United States. The No Ban Act would protect the rights of both immigrants and United States citizens. As reported before, the travel ban has already separated thousands of U.S. citizens from their spouses and minor children. A crisis that grows by the day, the congressional banned action is desperately needed to reverse this humanitarian tragedy. And with that, I am proud to ask for affirmation of this ban of power.
I'm short. My name is also Brianna Thomas. I will be the first speaker from Liberty University. First, I want to start off by thanking James Madison University for hosting this tournament and giving all of us the opportunity, a lot of intelligent students studying different fields, the opportunity to come together and discuss important topics such as immigration. I also want to thank my university, Liberty University, for giving me the opportunities to travel to these tournaments and get to engage very intelligent people from different communities, as well as a Liberty debate team. That is all of my formalities. And with that being said, I will get right into my speech. While our opponents have presented reasons why the executive authority is problematic, the point of contestation of this debate should be highlighted in today's debate as the internal forms of violence that happen in the United States. Open border policies assume that the U.S. is a place immigrants should want to go to. However, our argument is that it is better for immigrants to avoid America due to its targeted and racist domestic policies and attitudes which result in physical and psychological violence. The first affirmative speaker said immigrants enrich our country, but the question of this debate should be, does our country do the same for them? More than 1 in 5 suspected hate crimes victimize Latinos, according to a News 21 analysis of responses to the National Crime Victimization Survey data from 2012 to 2016. Hate incidents targeted Latinos and immigrants often go beyond name-calling and intimidation. Victims and advocates also say they are too often the targets of assault, robberies, and even murder. In addition, an article released by the Yale University Sociology Department explained how brown and black immigrants, in particular throughout America, are victims of police brutality, mass incarceration, and mass shootings as a tool of white terrorism. What is important to realize is that these cases don't take into account an immigrant citizen status because foreign bodies are immediately criminalized as a result of the broader narrative painted by the majority population. The violence of the executive branch is also a direct result of xenophobic population. Thus, any attempt to restrict this authority cannot resolve the root of these problems, but creates more opportunities for internal violence to happen throughout the United States. Now, all of their arguments about why this current administration is bad is exactly why we shouldn't restrict executive authority, because that would only cause more backlash to these immigrants. The affirmative would be seen as an attack against the poster child the base has set up, which is really an attack on the base itself. The result is more targeted hate crimes and violent acts that increase the danger immigrants would face in this country. This is true whether the affirmative proposes to restrict all of its authority or even a part of it, because the immediate perception from the population is that their privilege and power would be under attack. The affirmative plan of the No Ban Act does not resolve these harms because it allows immigrants to come into the country insofar as to make sure the U.S. society is not harmed. Their first contention is that these policies cost the U.S. money. So the affirmative team is willing to bring in immigrants into this country where they will experience new forms of violence as long as it protects their own security and their own money. That is the act of devaluing their lives in favor of their own, which upholds the same superior mindset of the current population. Another aspect that increases harms against immigrants is the asylum-seeking process. The executive authority is currently moving to end this process, which we would say is a good thing because the way it is authorized is violent towards those seeking it, and the migrations to the U.S. are some of the most violent and dangerous journeys, with 1 in 6 women experiencing sexual assault and/or robbery. Now, we would also say, finally, I want to frame kind of how this debate will go on from this point on. The affirmative side will have one of 2 responses. The first will be that solving all of racism is impossible and unfair of a burden for them, so doing at least something is good. That is the rhetoric and ideology that always footnotes the concerns of those harms and always shifts the responsibility away from the government to be held accountable for not doing its job or promoting violence. The second answer they will provide is that the negative cannot resolve these harms and that we have to do something. So if the AF does something, they should win the debate. We will say that it is the first negative team does solve this, because if immigrants never come over in the first place, they will never experience the harms because this country is not great. Yes, the countries they currently live in may have harsh conditions, but trading a harsh condition for another is not the American dream. It is a rude awakening. For all of these reasons, the executive branch should not be restricted because the affirmative side will only shift the focus from the real problems, which is the specific attitudes and views of the people, that would only get worse post-plan, increase a drought of resources, and an increased amount of violence for immigration. So if this is a moral problem, you must vote negative.
Okay. So obviously everyone else gave their thanks, so I kind of have a little bit of a list. Obviously, I want to first thank James Madison. This has been an awesome opportunity to represent LSUS. Going into that, obviously, everyone at LSUS, my team members who could not come with us, we are ecstatic to actually represent you, and we hope you get this opportunity as well. Obviously, I'd like to thank my parents, my family, because without them, I would not be a debater. Going on, my coaches, Flynn Miller, Joe Ganakis, Bob Alexander, Trey Gibson, and AJ Edwards. All of you have made me essentially be able to get to this realm. I wouldn't be able to do it without you, especially AJ. Okay. We think that some of the questions that have been posed by the negative team are essential to respond to. We believe that racism is an issue, but when you look at the affirmative case, we provide a pragmatic solution to deal with it. Remember our second contention where we specifically say that we are trying to curtail marginalization, but what we are trying to do is do it in a pragmatic manner which allows for us to essentially stunt racism. But before we go over our on-case argumentation or all the different benefits from us trying to curtail executive authority, let's talk about those arguments provided. First off, we see the contention or the first point being the idea of violence. And they say that essentially anyone that comes into the United States faces discrimination and violence on a large scale. First off, obviously cross-apply our argumentation from the actual curtail marginalization. Even more so, the Council of American Islamic Relations talks about how the current Muslim ban harms Muslim communities. It marginalizes children, businesses, and mosques, all of which have seen skyrockets in hate crimes specifically because of current bills and bans like that. I'll answer your question.
There we go. Side affirmative makes the claim just then that racism is something that we can simply deal with. Is that what's going to happen when we reduce executive authority? Racism is going to be obliterated in society?
No, there's no way I would be able to come up here and say that you can completely get rid of racism. But when we see a substantial policy that is, Islamophobic, I would say that us repealing that, allowing it to not be present in the future, solves those problems or at least mitigates them. My next of two questions.
Sure. So you say to solve for this exclusion, you will allow a president to ban based on security justifications and with the justification of solving for international stability.
Actually, we have five different categories.
Sure, but those were two of your categories. My question is, who gets to decide what affects international stability and who gets to decide what is a security justification? Is it the racist Congress?
Yeah, I'm going to answer your question.
Cool.
So a specific piece of evidence talks about how this bill would essentially have three different checks. You have the judges, you have the actual Congress, and you have the individuals of the society. Those are the checks and balances to this system. So whenever they don't meet the categories that we provide, remember the five categories, based on credible evidence, not based on religion, narrowly tailored, least restrictive, specific duration, and ample exemptions. What we see is, again, that this would actually allow us to check the system, but let's go on more to what their argument is. They say that the root cause is never going to be solved, and we agree that ultimately racism is going to be intrinsic within the United States, but what we are going to say is that this is the first step in actually passing policies and restricting policies that can actually discriminate individuals on a pragmatic level. Let's go to the second point, which is backlash. They say that hate crimes are essentially going to rise if you vote for the innate affirmative team, but let's remember that hate crimes have been present without our entire history. When we look at desegregation, when we look at individuals getting substantial rights, we didn't hold ourselves back and say, hey, there's going to be hate crimes. No, we pushed forward even more so cross-applied the argument where we talk about how we stop racism in a pragmatic level when you're talking about the Islamic phobia that exists and is pertinent within these communities. They say that we should stop asylum seekers from making it to the United States, but let's understand where those individuals are coming from. A great example would be that of the nation of Syria, a country that is facing civil war, large-scale poverty, individuals not being able to get fed, and the negative team's telling you, well, it's fine because it's going to be better than the alternative. But let's remember, I would definitely rather have a United States where I at least have some protections in the asylum seekers than being in my own home. Going on, they say that they basically try to come up here and preempt a lot of the arguments that we're going to provide. They say that racism is never going to be solved and in fact shifts away from the focus and discussion. But let's remember, my partner came up here and the first or second thing that we talk about is marginalization. That is an important discussion. We can have both while looking through a lens of non-racism pass a policy like this. So with that being said, as most of our arguments and ideas haven't really been addressed, let's go on to them. First off, we talked to you about the executive authority that's essentially going on and because of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Remember that Cato Institute reports that millions of individuals are being marginalized. Whether or not you look at the first, second, or third iteration of the travel ban, significant losses affect our states. Let's go to the second point, which is the economic impact. They don't respond to this, but the Council of Foreign Relations in 2016 talks about how we could lose $14 billion billion to $30 billion. That state and local government taxes would be lost, and even more so that there would be a brain drain to STEM and technology services that are extremely important within the United States. But obviously, the most important part, the idea of curtailing marginalization. Cato talks about how essentially, whenever you look at this bill in the status quo, because no one is checking Trump, it's essentially going to be open season whenever you look at actual future policies. That's why my partner comes up here and talks about the individuals and asylum seekers already being targeted. By us putting this ban on, or the No Ban Act, we can essentially stop future policies from going into place and set a precedence for the future. Thank you.
Hi. My name's Alexandra Green. That was really loud. I'm so sorry. My name's Alexandra Green. I'm from Liberty University. Just like everyone else, I have a couple people I'd like to thank. I'd obviously like to thank James Madison for having us here, for hosting this tournament, for running a really well thought out tournament. I'd like to thank the Nagys from Liberty Debate for driving us and for feeding us. I'd also like to thank Natalie and Ryan for being here with us and supporting us. And of course, my partner Bree. She's fabulous. We love her. So yeah, I'll just get right into it. The affirmative's bright narrative of an open border policy relies on the notion that the immigration process, as long as it's allowed to happen, is good. But my partner has clearly presented sufficient evidence that this process of migration includes hate crimes, targeted robberies, planned and brutal murders, and unrecognized sexual assault, none of which Congress has ever solved, even though they can. The courts have checked Trump on the Muslim ban and have checked Trump on completely eradicating DACA, but Congress and the courts are unwilling to enact actual legislation to solve these minute problems of how the immigrants themselves are treated in that process. They are content with a shutdown that may prevent the wall. They are content with negative action, but are unwilling to initiate positive action to create an actual policy to deal with violence against immigrants. In the last point of inquiry, they said that judges and Congress and the people will check Trump. My question is, if judges and Congress and the people will check Trump, why isn't that already happening? They said that the Supreme Court allowed Trump to still have the Muslim ban on 5 countries. If courts will check Trump, why does the Muslim ban still exist? If Congress will check Trump, why has no policy reform been enacted? If people will check Trump, why is he elected? I'll take my first question.
Yeah, so specifically, you're saying that your ban is, or that you're saying that you don't want anyone to come into the country specifically.
I am saying
well,
that.
I haven't asked my question yet.
You just said that we said, okay, whatever.
Yeah, it was a statement. So your question, my question specifically here is that you want people not to come into the country. So with the asylum seekers especially in mind, how are you protecting them from anything? A lot of these people are coming from situations such as rape, war, violence.
So this is right. So I'll answer that. My problem is that when you say I would rather come into the U.S. than be from Syria, you are speaking as white men who, when you come through the migration process, are not targeted for things like sexual assault or do not have to experience targeting by employers, do not have to experience targeting by people who refuse to hire you because you are an immigrant. These immigrants experience specific targeting because of where they are coming from and because of their social location that recreate those same problems of poverty and famine and assault. The war is here. That's our problem. You assume that the war is just in Syria. The war for these immigrants is here. Second question.
Throughout your speech, you recognize Congress's ability to curtail impacts of racism. So what makes the No Ban Act any different than those positive actions that you affirm in your case?
Nice knocking. I said that Congress actually didn't curtail this. Congress makes it appear like they're curtailing it, i.e. we'll take the Muslim ban to court, but Supreme Court will still allow 5 countries to be on that Muslim ban. We'll make it look like we're doing something without actually having to invest any political capital because the Congress is unwilling to take a stance on racist rhetoric because that would mean losing too much political capital for them because guess what? Newsflash, Congress is racist. All right. I asked the judge to note that the executive is not the only branch with power in the status quo, that Congress has the ability but not the will to restrict the executive and enact laws, as does the judiciary. The government does not want to check the executive branch. You should ask yourself questions. They say, allow the president to ban due to security justifications and international stability. Who determines what is a security justification or what is international stability? They say it has to be the least restrictive. Who defines what is least restrictive? It's Congress. Congress in the status quo does not care about these immigrants, which is why those statistics that my partner represented in her first speech are still happening. When the affirmative gets up and say, at least we're trying something, that's that footnoting violence that says that as long as we look like we're solving racist violence, we don't actually have to solve for anything because as long as we're getting the economic benefits from immigrants, we don't have to worry about the violence that they're experiencing. This matters. This is the whole footnoting argument that they totally conceded. That's the word you should keep in mind throughout this entire debate. When the affirmative gets up and tries to talk around racism to say that doing something is better than doing nothing, they are footnoting the racist violence that inflicts real psychological and physical harm on immigrants deemed as not quite citizen enough to make the AF go back to the drawing board. Do not accept the affirmative's arguments based on a feel-good politics that incentivizes you to support them under the illusion that you are helping immigrants. That illusion allows us to sweep immigration reform under the table instead of actually taking this seriously. Restricting executive authority is not enough. Giving it to Congress is not enough. Only the education the negative provides regarding the way immigrant bodies are criminalized, targeted, and treated can begin to fight back against structural problems that the affirmative just doesn't address. It is better to go back to the drawing board than to make a bad prototype the final product. Another point, they ignore other legislation that thumps the way the affirmative will be enacted. For example, the Chevron doctrine is the result of a court case which decided that executive agencies can interpret congressional legislation and judicial legislation however they want. This is important. You should ask yourself, like I said earlier, who determines what security justification is? It's those executive agencies that the affirmative has already criticized as being reactionary politics. Those executive agencies get to interpret the congressional restrictions that they're advocating for because of Chevron doctrine. Their inability to address the system writ large, which is the negatives argument, means that any reform they suggest in this round will not be comprehensive enough to solve the problems.
Check, check. All right, so before I begin my speech, I just really do want to thank everybody here, my opponents, my teammates, specifically Lindsay, thank you so much for being here. I also want to thank my university, specifically my university debate team. They've been fantastic, and I really want to single out my debate coach, Charles DeBerry. He's a fantastic man, has done so much, cares about all his students, and essentially my debate team is the reason I'm here, and I can't be more grateful. So, with that in mind, I want to start my speech by discussing this argument that Congress hasn't enacted legislation to combat racist policy, which shows that they themselves are racist. But I would disagree with this notion because the president hasn't been held accountable to Congress by nature of his authority. Essentially, because of the current state of presidential authority, he hasn't been able to be held accountable for any type of racist action to Congress. I'm going to explain this a little bit more. We need to first understand the Take Care Clause. Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution requires the president to take due care of executing Congress's laws. But, as have already been stated, the president is given significant authority over immigration enforcement priorities, which is essentially the ability to choose and prioritize which groups of people get deported. The reason this was created and enacted was so that people would be able to be targeted who were undesirable within the country, like people who committed crimes who were here illegally, or people who were a threat to our national security. But since then, that has been significantly expanded by the Trump administration. Now, I'll go ahead and take whoever stood up first.
Great. So you talk about how the president is not being able to held accountable by Congress. One of the main tools that the executive authority has used in immigration deportation rules is ICE. One of the main things that Congress representatives advocated for to get elected was that they would disband ICE. As soon as they got elected, they came out with a press conference that was like, JK, we're not going to disband ICE. So they have had the opportunity to hold the president accountable and have chosen not to, which my question then would become, how then, why is now a unique reason, or why is now a unique time to actually trust Congress to do the job when they had the chance and chose not to do it?
Okay, I'd say you're speaking a little bit too soon for Congress, considering they were just recently elected in November. We don't know what they're going to do yet. With that in mind, I just want to talk about how the control that the president has over enforcement guidelines allow the president to refuse to enforce congressional intent. So think about the Obama administration. It passed DACA. I'll not be taking questions right now. It passed DACA because he was upset with Congress striking down the DREAM Act, which would have provided protections to certain groups of undocumented immigrants. So in other words, Congress voted against extending protections against deportation to certain illegal immigrants, but the president chose to do so anyway by setting enforcement guidelines against the will of the the legislative branch. So what we have to understand is that the Congress is not enforcing the legislation that they need to. The executive is not enforcing the legislation that Congress has on the books or the intent of the legislative branch. Can I take your question?
Sure. You've made a couple of things. You've made a couple of interesting arguments. You said the president isn't being held accountable by congressional restrictions because of the nature of his authority. If you're using congressional restrictions to change the nature of his authority, how do those work? / why doesn't the president just ignore them, since that's what he's already doing?
I mean, I think that the affirmative did a great job in their first speeches. They talked about the No Ban Act, but furthermore, they could also set their own enforcement priorities. That's the main problem right now with how the president is executing his authority. Now, let's talk about how enforcement guidelines allow the overexpansion of enforcement by the president. According to the American Immigration Council, in March of 2018, the Trump administration expanded enforcement priorities so broadly as to render the term meaningless. Essentially, all undocumented immigrants have become targets, even if they have lived in the United States for many years, have U.S.-born children, and have never had a run-in with law enforcement. So essentially, he's expanded enforcement guidelines to include all illegal immigrants. And the result, according to Human Rights Watch in 2018, is that the number of deportations in 2017 increased by 42% from 2016, with the number of undocumented immigrants with no criminal record tripling. Since the president prioritizes the deportation of all undocumented immigrants as opposed to focusing on the most dangerous or important individuals, ICE's budget has increased by more than 70%, on the order of $1.3 billion, according to NPR. And the Republican-led Senate Subcommittee for Homeland Security calls this unsustainable. So we have to understand, at the point that the president is using his authority to expand these priority guidelines to include all illegal immigrants, he is not focusing on the ones that are a threat to our national security. He's focusing on mothers. He's focusing on people who own businesses. He's focusing on people who do not need to leave this country, and he's wasting resources on them on the order of $1.3 billion. Now, the solution is that Congress should set enforcement guidelines for the president's execution of immigration law. This goes in line with the affirmative team's first call for Congress to set guidelines through the No Ban Act, but it expands it a little bit more broadly to understand that Congress, if they set these enforcement guidelines, the current Congress is the most diverse Congress we've ever had. Look at the trends of the most recently elected Congress. They're the most diverse in history. They have the most number of immigrants and the most number of immigrant children that have been elected in recent times. So holding the president accountable to those enforcement priorities set by that Congress would be net beneficial for immigrants and the protection of immigrants' rights. We don't want a racist society. We're trying to do something about racist laws that the president has implemented by making congressional oversight necessary to the enforcement of those laws and making Congress involved in the setting of enforcement guidelines for immigration law. It's for all these reasons I asked for a ballot in negation. Thank you all very much.
Hi. Excuse me. Before I begin, I would like to extend our sentiments of gratitude first to the Arthur and Root Foundation. We are also thankful for your support of this tournament, and for James Madison University, thank you for hosting us on your incredible campus. Thank you to all of the judges for your time today, and for our moderator for being here, and also thank you to the audience for being here to listen to us with this productive discourse. Thank you to the University of Arkansas administration for making this trip possible, also for the support of the University of Central Arkansas and Arkansas Tech University. Thank you to my family for supporting me along this trip, and thank you to Rachel for being my incredible partner. I've looked up to you for years, and I'm so humbled to get to debate alongside you today. And finally, thank you to Antha Johnson, my high school debate coach, and the Arkansas Community Theater Arts Association for your endless commitment to encouraging people of Arkansas to be a voice for those who are not heard. So with that, I will get started. According to Thurgood Marshall, where you see wrong or inequality or injustice, speak out, because this is your country. Make it, protect it, and pass it on. Because of our desire to speak out for all people, we stand in negation of the topic that the United States federal government should significantly reduce executive authority over immigration. On side negative, we believe immigration to be a critical impact of the true beauty of the United States. But a decrease in executive authority will have negative consequences, short-term and long-term. Thus, we negate. We do not want to simply assume that immigration will be resolved by reducing executive authority. And without a comprehensive reform that the affirmative fails to provide, you must vote neg. Economic benefits should not be prioritized in today's debate. Rather, we must recognize the racial injustice and human rights violations instead of simply putting a Band-Aid on an issue that is far more deep. We stand on common ground with the affirmative as fellow advocates for immigration. But this debate ultimately pertains to the extent of power vested within the executive to achieve these common goals of overcoming a myriad of human rights violations to achieve liberty and justice for all, not whether or not the executive is acting in accordance with any favored political ideology. I'll take your question.
Hi. So, just for clarification purposes, are you abandoning your earlier thesis that immigration to the United States is bad because it is an inherently violent act, or do you defend immigration broadly?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question? I can't hear.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry. Just as a point of clarification, are you abandoning your earlier thesis that immigration to the United States is inherently violent and therefore should be stopped, or are you sort of shifting your argument to argue that immigration is good broadly?
Thank you for your question. I would like to say that we believe that if people are experiencing violations coming over in the migration process, then maybe they shouldn't come. But for people, like immigration is good holistically, and ultimately this debate isn't ultimately about whether or not it's good or bad, but it's about where that power is derived from. And so we're not saying that, I mean, if people are facing violations, then no, they shouldn't come, but it's not about the economic impacts that result from that. Yes.
So you're saying that if they don't experience if they do experience violations here, then they shouldn't come over. But what is the answer on team negation that when the violations they're experiencing in their homeland are exponentially worse, war crimes, rape? We look to Syria where children are being bombed with chemical gases. This is massive compared to the experiences they would have here in the United States with protections to at least not inhale chemical gases.
Thank you for your question. And again, I believe that it's not within the power of the United States president to solve all of the issues that these people are facing. We're not a savior who's going to come in to all of these people's countries and solve every problem that they're facing, but it is within our role and within our sphere of influence to have the ability to help these people with their current situations and to use the power of an executive in a different way rather than reducing their executive power, but to keep their power so that we can to help them to get out of their current situations, but not be the savior within it. So going back to my point, any one president's ideology or stance towards immigration reform does not justify a complete reconfiguration of authority over immigration as a whole. This is a critical issue that transcends any presidential term and will carry with us far beyond the 2020 presidential election. This must be considered when making any change. Checks and balances have guided federal decision-making since the founding of our great nation, and we must preserve this constitutional provision to protect the future of our nation. I appreciate that the affirmative today did provide checks and balances as a part of their counterplan, but I don't think that it solves, and I think that we need to look to the current status quo and improve the checks and balances within the national government rather than doing it on a non-comprehensive form of reform. So instead of reducing executive authority, we should work to improve upon judicial and congressional oversight, a significant foundational concept that effectively keeps the executive accountable instead of aimlessly using structural change, which is what the AF advocates to do. They want to curtail marginalization and point to the increasingly diverse Congress that we have today, which is absolutely incredible. However, our Congress today is also in one of the most polarized states that it has ever been. Investing the power that's in the executive in this polarized state of Congress will only perpetuate the stagnation and policy gridlock that is happening, and this will pull us further and further away from finding tangible solutions to help and solve these problems within immigration. We stand in negation because we want to not find a simple solution to a systematic issue or simply put a Band-Aid over a greater problem, but we want to prioritize the United States and the dreams of immigrants wishing to come here so that the American dream might become a dream come true.
All right, in addition to everybody who's spoken before me, I also want to start off by giving a round of thank yous. First and foremost, to my debate team at Drury University. I wouldn't be here without them. They are some of the most supportive people that I have ever known, especially my coach, Dr. Charles DeBerry. It was his last year with us this year, and I'm sure he's very proud back at home. That in mind, I'd also like to thank James Madison University. It's always encouraging to us as debaters to be around an administration that supports the institution of debate. That said, let's go ahead and get started. The team in negation today has primarily revolved their case around two main concepts. First, this idea that any action the affirmation take would simply be racist. That is not true. Ultimately, what we see in society now are absolutely problems, but what we see from the side of the affirmation is we see the ability to curtail the impacts of that racism. First, the plan that the affirmation presents to us, specifically with this No Ban Act. We see the benefits of that act absolutely as we continue this debate in today's debate. But additionally, we see benefits as we move to the side of the negation affirmation in a moment. But additionally, they ask us the question, is this effective? Will Congress have teeth? Will this bill have teeth? And the answer is absolutely. According to the University of Illinois, we see that the executive branch is continuously checked by both the judicial and legislative branches in regards to immigration. Now, we see a lot of policies passed that we may not support, but in the status quo, those are okay, which is exactly why we're going to make the changes that we are on the side of the affirmation today to tell the people of this nation that it is not okay to behave in the ways that we are, therefore solving or at least mitigating a lot of the conflicts presented by the affirmation. Now let's go ahead and look at some other additional points. First is going to be this idea of the prosecution's manifestation. As soon as President Trump assumed office, we actually saw ICE abolish these priorities of deliberation, determining to prioritize removing the most violent immigrants and now just removing immigration at large, treating mothers, children like violent criminals, which is simply not acceptable. Your question.
So we've talked a lot about this round about checks and balances, and we've seen how the executive is being checked by both the courts and Congress. My question for you then is on the subject of immigration. By stripping the executive of their authority to have a say on immigration, who checks Congress?
I would like to clarify first and foremost, we are not removing the executive from authority at all. They still play a valuable role to some degree. We are just simply limiting their ability to curtail. But now let's go ahead and move on. Now the first affirmation team from Liberty specifically talks to us about ICE. ICE is so problematic in the status quo because they don't have enforcement priorities. Trump has simply abandoned these. And in his first year, we saw ICE arrests jump from 41 to 171%. The impact of this is that we have overburdened local law enforcement. I'll jump to that in just a moment. Your question from University of Arkansas.
So do you believe that taking this power away from the executive, or at least reducing it and placing it in the hands of a more polarized Congress, will lead to pragmatic change?
So what we see uniquely in Congress is this idea of deliberation. Like the team from LSUS pointed out, is we actually see one of the most diverse Congresses we have ever seen. And that gives us hope for the future to move forward. Now going back to the impact, specifically we see that these manifestations, once again, lead to a costly city budget. For example, according to the Government Accountability Office, 62% of local law enforcement agencies that participate in these programs receive no federal funds. Additionally, we see a burden on these local law enforcement agencies. Specifically here, we see them diverting resources from other criminal matters and deter crime reporting by ruining the relationship that they have specifically with the immigrant population. I won't be taking any more questions. Thank you. Moving on to the third point today, we see the immigration court backlog. Again, because of the lack of discretion that we see from the presidency currently, we see that the immigration court system, which resides within the executive branch, has far too large of a backlog. Specifically, we see that there's currently over 1 million cases waiting to be heard, according to the American Bar Association. Additionally, we see that 1 out of every 40 cases is criminal, meaning that we are wasting a lot of time in our immigration court system now, focusing on literally every immigrant, with absolutely no jurisdiction for who to prioritize first. Additionally, we see that the Trump administration has paused the hiring of immigration judges, meaning that right now the executive branch is trying to hear all of these immigration cases with only 400 judges. The side of the affirmation today recognizes the drastic harms in this and advocates that we now curtail this by allowing Congress to once again pursue the laws that they actually intend. My partner, Mr. Caleb Conaway, explained to us specifically the Take Care Clause, meaning that Congress is going to be able to curtail their own legislation to meet their own goals. It makes sense to us today that when Congress is going to pass a law, we know what to do with it. We know who it's targeting and who ought to be protected from that. That way we're able to absorb the most amount of benefits and see a decrease in all of the harms that the team from Liberty specifically pointed out today. We believe that immigration is important, just like the team from the University of Arkansas, which is why we want to mitigate the impacts that we are seeing to those individuals. Additionally, today, we want to go ahead and make sure that we are doing as much as we can to protect these communities by offering another form of checks and balances. We see that they are working in the status quo when we want to go ahead and protect against unauthorized action. Now we need to make sure we are curtailing the laws once again to make sure that the president stays in his lane, just like the executive ought to. For these reasons, I ask for a ballot on the affirmation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rachel Mocklin. I would just like to also extend the sentiment with a couple of thank yous. Firstly, to the Author and Root Foundation for allowing this event to actually happen, along with James Madison University. I'd also like to thank the judges and moderators, both from the final round, but also in preliminary debates. I would also like to thank specifically three people, Anthony Johnson, Rosie Valdez, and Julie Howe for all their support. I also like to thank my partner, obviously Sarah Gardner, for putting up with me for the past couple of days. It's been pretty tough. And with that, let's jump into the debate. Sarah gets up here in the last speech and tells you about the American dream. However, this has become a nightmare for immigrants across the world. That's what you need to remember when you look at today's debate. Now let's isolate a couple of issues which need clarification, which is going to be the purpose of this speech. Let's begin with the rhetoric of the affirmative. When they make arguments saying that we should deal with racism and that we can stop racism, that is flawed. That is the logic of the Congress of the United States right now. That is the logic of the executive, and that's the logic of side affirmative, and that's the reason why it's never going to happen. They do not address the fact that racism is a systemic issue that will not be solved for with the affirmative plan. That's the reason why you have to vote for the negative, because we have structural problems. We hear arguments such as the terms crimmigration, which what this means is an inherent criminalization of immigrants of color coming to the United States. This crimmigration is unique to the United States, which is a reason why it shouldn't be the country that these immigrants are coming to. This second argument is about ban areas, but of course, I'm going to take this question.
So you talk about crimmigration. The Trump administration has codified into law crimmigration by expanding authority to prosecute literally all immigrants in this country and deport them. How then would the negative side solve for this problem if not curtailing that authority?
We agree that immigration and crimmigration are inherently bad. On side negation, we believe the state itself is bad, specifically the executive, but also Congress and the judiciary, which means that if we eradicate that system, that's why you should negate. But let's go to the second reason, which is the ban areas. I'm going to get to those questions after this point. They talk about specific areas of the ban, such as Syria and Muslim-based countries. But the fact is there is no articulation that the U.S. caused these problems. The Arab Spring in 2010 was the reason why Syria is in a civil war. It's the reason why ISIS is forming. It's the reason why these refugees are coming to the United States right now. That is the problem that side affirmative does not seem to grasp. That is why you should negate. I'm going to take this point now.
Sorry. So assuming then that, again, that our rhetoric is that no one should be coming into the United States, wouldn't that then curtail all powers that the executive branch would have over anyone that then couldn't come in? So saying that the president then has no power over what's not taking place, then affirming the resolution?
No, because they're not going to be coming to the United States. And secondly, that isn't going to decrease executive authority. It will make it the same because he won't have authority on anything. And if you're going to make that argument, you also don't have that as your plan in the original place, which would be shifting the debate very late on and making it incredibly confusing. The third articulation of argument that is not addressed well by the affirmative is what Congress can actually do. Now, the previous speaker makes arguments about deliberation. However, when has deliberation actually caused anything? We saw DACA take 2.5 years to actually make it to the president because Congress takes that long deliberating, I'm not taking any more questions, in a partisan environment, and that's problematic. We hear from the questioner from Liberty about the press conference. If they've had 4 months in order to make change in Congress. Why are they able to have a press conference saying they will abolish ICE and then they're not going to do it the next minute? That's the reason why Congress is spending too much time deliberating, too much time making fake promises, and not actually creating change. So when we say that we're going to reduce authority to the executive and give it to the legislative, that isn't going to create change, and that's the problem with the side affirmative in today's debate. But ultimately, the question that we have to ask in this round is the world of the affirmative better than the world of the negative? Now, yes, the side of the negative is radical. We agree that decreasing and curtailing and completely stopping immigration seems like an absurd concept. But if you think about the marginalization, if you think about the oppression, if you think about the term crimmigration and what that truly means, this is different from me coming up as a Scottish immigrant telling you from a white perspective. But immigrants of color are being victimized in the status quo. People are being sexually assaulted. People are being victimized. People are being raped on our borders, and no one is doing anything. This is not going to change in the world of the affirmative. This is simply going to be magnified. The argument here is that Trump has a base right now. His base thinks that anything he does is golden. If we reduce executive authority, Trump's base is inherently going to lash out with more alt-right forms of terrorism and forms of aggression against immigrants. That turns the thesis of the affirmative, because if we have that increase in alt-right terrorism, it's going to victimize and harm immigrants. That is the problem. because whether you vote for the affirmative or the negative, there are structural problems. Debate as an activity is critical to create that discourse. Throughout the debate so far, we've agreed there is a systemic problem, but the affirmative is not willing to agree that the AFT plan will not solve it. The systemic racism that is embedded in our country today is something that we need to vote negative on for a stance, because ultimately, voting for the negative is critical. Debate is important, but voting for the negative and proving racism is a problem is even more important than today's debate. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. I would just like to reiterate my thanks to the Arthur and Roop Foundation for making this entire event possible, as well as the James Madison University debate team and the James Madison Cup committee for running such an excellent tournament. I'd like to thank our director of debate, Michaela Mollison, for everything she does to further our program, as well as our coaches, Brandon Kelly and Ezra Luvis, as well as all of my teammates, friends, and parents for their continued support. Finally, I'd like to thank John Hawk, both for debating with me today, as well as putting up with all of my really bad jokes. Let's begin. The core question animating whether you vote affirmative or negative in today's debate should be the question of whether the No Ban Act is good as a mechanism of curtailing executive authority. Any other consideration is fundamentally irrelevant. We have isolated 5 reasons the negative brings up for why the affirmative is a bad idea. But first, I think they fail to come to terms with our argument about marginalization. When a travel ban is imposed, it creates a zone of exclusion that targets every single member from a particular nation as deviant and other, and argues they cannot come to the United States, regardless of whether they want to come or not. That process of stigmatization in of itself is inherently violent, and we should not be saying you should be singled out for legal sanction simply because you come from an area. Now, the first argument is that we should discourage immigration broadly. However, this is essentially paternalistic. It may be the case that the affirmative is not incommensurate with the broader processes to spread awareness about the systematic violence and injustices happening within the immigration system. However, it may also be the case that some people choose to brave those risks for hope of a better future, and we should give them the option to come to the U.S. if possible, which basically just means we should not ban them if they want to come. We do not sort of make a normative stance about increasing immigration more broadly. Your question.
You make an argument that it's paternalistic for us to kind of decide whether they should be allowed to come or not. It should be their choice. I'm confused how the affirmative plan is not then paternalistic when your entire reasoning for the No Ban Act is to save the U.S. economy and your safe money and prioritize your safety and your money out of security and the economy.
The economic aspect of the affirmative is certainly one aspect, but it's not incommensurable with other arguments that indicate that the travel ban in of itself is a moral hazard and we should not engage in it. I'd like to move on if possible. Their second argument is that a better alternative would be to eradicate the state in its entirety. 3 responses. First, the affirmative is necessarily a step in preventing the state from imposing further violence. So if you think the state does bad things in the first place, then the affirmative probabilistically curtails that process. Second, the affirmative is not an normative endorsement of the state. Rather, it argues that the state should not be allowed to do things that are bad. It does not make a normative judgment about the nature of the state in the first place. Third, they argue that if we were to say eradicating the state is a reason to affirm, then that's shifting the plan text. In technical terms, that is a plan plus counterplan, and it is not mutually exclusive with the affirmative. If they wish to decrease all executive authority, it is not incommensurate with decreasing executive authority in the area of the travel ban, which means if we decrease all executive authority over immigration, it's still a reason to affirm, and it is not competitive. Your question.
Cool. So I brought up a doctrine in my second negative speech that the affirmative hasn't answered. It's called the Chevron doctrine. What the Chevron doctrine did was that congressional legislation / judicial legislation gets deferred to interpretation by executive agencies.
Sure.
No ban
is
congressional legislation that gets deferred to those executive agencies that get
I'm actually
to
really glad
implement
you brought that up.
How do you solve that?
I'd like to clarify something about the Chevron doctrine. It is not about any congressional delegation of statutory authority to the executive, but only when the executive creates rulemaking things like EPA standards that are based on very specific rulemaking delegations to the executive. The affirmative piece of legislation which bans travel bans is not a sort of delegation of rulemaking authority to the executive, so Chevron does not apply here. Their fourth argument Sorry, the third argument is this footnoting argument. However, we've already answered that earlier because the affirmative does not sort of vest itself in just this sort of broader narrative of reformism. We merely argue that creating these zones of exclusion is a bad idea, and we don't really say anything about the sort of broader movement against immigration. Your question.
Thank you. How does investing our political capital in structural reform rather than addressing the issue of immigration reform itself create pragmatic change?
I don't think those two are mutually exclusive, and if you think that just passing the plan, which very, very strictly bans travel bans, is in of itself a good idea. The fourth argument is that the affirmative violates separation of powers doctrine. This is simply not the case. Congress has every single right to clarify earlier delegated statutory authority, in this case, the Immigration and Nationalization Act, which means this is not set as precedent, such as a Supreme Court case or a congressional amendment that would affect future executive authority. It would only affect executive authority within the ambit of the travel ban, which means its arguments about separation of powers is fundamentally moot. The final argument is about backlash. We are not going to let ourselves be held hostage to white nationalists. We're not going to let ourselves say, let's go ahead and target specific countries and let them be banned from entering the United States just because we're afraid that white nationalists will carry out terroristic demands. Preventing moral action on behalf of some external agent is inherently immoral. If that were the case, we would have no civil rights progress over the last 50 years in this country, and you should clearly vote affirmative to prevent these zones of exclusion from being formed. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Cool. So some brief thank yous. First of all, to Paul Hayes from the GW debate team for offering us the opportunity to debate this tournament, providing our registration fees, all the stuff that we needed to get here. That was absolutely necessary, and we really, really appreciate it in giving us this opportunity to do this. Second, to the George Washington Parliamentary Debate Society and our coach, Andrew Bowles, for just being wonderful, supportive individuals who have enabled us to have great times in debate. This entire tournament, the judges, competitors, viewers, for hosting and having a great discussion about immigration that I think has been very, very informative and very, very impactful on a personal level. My family, for being wonderful individuals that have empowered my entire life and my capacity to get here, and then Parker, for being a wonderful debate partner. If he walks up here with a limp, it's because he's been carrying me all weekend, so be generous to him. All right, without further ado, I'm gonna get started. So, to understand the context of this debate, I think there are a couple of observations that we need to make. The first of which is that it's not just Trump. This debate is not a referendum on Trump or or just Trump as unique as a presidency, but rather how does the presidency and the executive branch interact with other branches in our government in terms of immigration policy, and how we can get the optimal immigration policy on that. Secondarily, though, about Congress. We think that my question earlier in this round was not sufficiently answered. There is no extra check on Congress. Congress now has fewer checks on immigration policy and will now dominate immigration policy in a way that's significantly worse. Our entire thesis on the negative bench is that we believe that people should have information when they go to immigrate places to make sure they're aware of the dangers and abuses that can come to them. I think holistically, by giving Congress more individual power for this, you decrease the amount of information people make informed choices about their immigration decisions and ultimately lead to people living worse outcomes for those individuals. It's not a paternalistic claim, but rather one that enables for information for individuals. So in this speech, I'm going to do three things. The first of which is to explain why in the status quo, checks and balances are working in an optimal way that provides the most amount of information and prevents the worst abuses. Second, I'll explain to you why Congress is uniquely a bad actor and will now no longer have the same checks and balances that are so important. And third and finally, I'll explain whether there's just going to be general politicization of immigration that'll be as toxic they've been talking about earlier, but even worse. I'll take you.
Yeah, so specifically you say that the status quo is preventing the worst abuses and the worst violence. And with that sort of rhetoric of what you just said, doesn't it counteract the entire case that we shouldn't bring immigrants over because we have such a bad situation going on?
It can be bad, and it can still get worse. I'm explaining to you why it is the optimal scenario right now with very poor conditions and very bad ideas about race in this country, and why your side of the House will make things worse. And yes?
One of the primary lines of argumentation coming from the entire table of the negation seems to be that no one is doing anything. So why exactly would it be bad to pass the No Ban Act, fulfill the Take Care Act, and to curtail some of the worst impacts within immigration courts rather than sit idly by and allow the status quo to persist?
By allowing Congress to take even a small portion of the executive authority, you're opening the door for more and more encroachments upon that executive authority, compiling into one singular body that has fewer checks and balances. I've already taken two, my apologies. So, why do we think the status quo is solving? First, we've seen the courts act in a decisive way against the president. Recognize that this is unique to the president, not to the Congress. When the president makes a decision about executive orders regarding immigration, he has to justify it as a national emergency. The courts, with Trump specifically, have made checks on this and told him, hey, this is not an example of a national crisis. You can't do this. This has been a unique check that has worked in many times with many of the examples of executive orders that have been brought up in this debate. Secondarily, Congress itself checks the president. They have the power of the purse to fund the agencies, and they also authorize the policies that he's taking. They are the ones that are directing the immigration policies brought up by the second affirmative team. What this means, therefore, is that there's no alternative, better policy that can come from Congress. Congress is tacitly endorsing the things done by the president and are ultimately be less checked by other groups of individuals because they're uniquely less held accountable than the president. Third is the states. The states can do things like sanctuary cities and litigation against the president in unique ways that can ultimately target them in high-profile cases that set strong precedent for states' rights regarding questions of immigration, protecting more people than not. Fourth, elections. Recognize that the population sees the question of immigration as a national issue. They look towards the president rather than, say, their local Iowa congressman for answers about immigration. When immigration policy goes awry and does things that hurt individuals, the electoral backlash that comes in that way, the compassion of the people on the ground recognizing that other countries doing something profoundly immoral, is targeted not at Congress, but at the president. The president is therefore uniquely receptive to the public's will that Congress is not, and is therefore the face of these policies in a way that congressmen individually never are. Fifth, the agencies themselves. The agencies are technocratic individuals that can speak the president's language. They work with him day to day and can convince him to take better policies. We think that the agencies uniquely under the presidency and under the executive authority of the presidency do a better dialogue and a better technocratic leveraging of the immigration policy rather than random congressmen who have never done immigration policy for the past 30 years because they've done literally nothing and also don't really listen to the agencies because they don't work with them on a day-to-day basis and are deeply divided and politicized themselves. Which brings me to my second point, which is why I think Congress is uniquely bad at its job. No experience is a very important part. Second part is that they have a worse relationship with the agencies. The technocrats who have the actual information about immigration policy that can tailor it in the best way. They simply don't listen to them many of the time, and these agencies can no longer direct their language in one person's rhetoric in a way that's meaningful. Finally, we think that the president better reflects his national will. The optics means that they're better held accountable by the electorate than Congress is. Finally, backlash. Why would Trump ever let this happen? He can very clearly take this question to the courts, fight it down to the very end of it, and he can, after that, just Kim Davis the whole thing and choose not to enforce the policies or ignore the policies set forward by Congress. This can trigger a constitutional crisis, which will only toxify the issue of immigration far, far more than they are already doing. By making it a constitutional question, one that's linked to the identity of this nation, simultaneously the question of the racial identity of this nation with immigration, I think we're going to get far, far more anti-immigrant rhetoric as we see and people perceptualize this as a way of getting immigrants through the back door by violating our own constitutional principles. For decades and decades, we've recognized that the presidency has executive authority towards this question of immigration to a large degree. Congress and the president work together with agencies to do this. By shifting it away to Congress, you damage the discourse, you make it fundamentally more powerful for the Congress, who ultimately agree with Trump's policies more often than not, as implemented by their actions so far, and ultimately make the country far less safe for the immigrants who now don't know what's happening. Proud to host.
Let's get to this at the right height. Testing. Okay, I think that works. All right. I also have a quick list of thank yous. I promise they'll be quick. I'd like to thank first James Madison University for hosting this tournament and making it run so great. No complaints about how anything was run today. Thank you to the Arthur N. Roop Foundation for providing the funds necessary to make this event happen and for being wonderful sponsors of debate. To all of our opponents and teammates over the last day for providing intellectual discussion, to all the judges who have volunteered their time, to Michaela, who has put up with me and Victor for the last day, and finally to Victor. Yeah, there are a lot of bad jokes. All right. And okay, is everyone ready? The first thing that I would like to talk about today is addressing the central nexus question of what exactly the affirmative does. The affirmative passes the No Ban Act, which would essentially place very strict limits on the ability of the president to ban entry from a specific zone of the world and prevent the exact sort of Muslim travel ban that was instituted in 2017. This is an incredibly important piece of legislation to pass because otherwise it enables the executive to have infinite flexibility to simply declare another zone of the world as simply dangerous and an other that should not be interacted with at all. This process of otherization, as my colleague from Georgetown has pointed out, is what causes the exact sort of white nationalist ideology that the negation has talked about. The exact sort of mentality that drives people to attend white nationalist rallies is the same mentality that's encoded within things like the Muslim ban. Therefore, creating solid red lines around presidential conduct is a necessary check in order to prevent this phenomenon from continuing. The negative argument about current checks being sufficient are simply incorrect. Congress has delegated far too much power thus far and has to take it back. The president, yes, has the ability to take care of the law, as my colleagues from jury have explained. The problem is that the president is not taking care of the law in a way that is faithful to the original intent of the law or faithful to our basic moral intuitions. People should not be banned from entering this country simply because they happen to originate from a specific place in the world that the president does not like. The problem with the last negation speaker's arguments about the nature of constraints on the executive is that they do not place a reliable check on swings in executive policy. Executive policy, in a world in which the executive branch can freely exercise discretion however it likes, will result in a policy that swings from every administration to every administration. Yes, sanctuary cities exist, but they end up becoming a bug rather than a feature in this system because it ends up flipping who is on the side of the immigrants between sanctuary cities and the federal government. During the Obama administration, Arizona attempted to enforce extremely zealous immigration laws that were contrary to the Obama administration. What this is designed to show is that the very structure of the constitutional arrangement right now cannot hold. The center cannot hold because the executive is granted far too much discretion. Now, as to the broader question of immigration as a principle, aside from the fact that it is not incommensurate with the idea that there should be a lowered amount of discretion for the executive branch. The negation has failed to grapple with the fundamental idea that immigrants should be given a simple choice to be able to come to this country or not. If it is given that the choice to immigrate to another country is one that's both deeply personal and one that contains a lot of intrinsic personal value to a lot of people, that is not a choice that should be a priori taken away from other people or determined by the negation side. Simply providing the option to immigrate here is not necessarily intrinsically violent and also does not at all trade off with the ability to grapple with larger forms of racism here. The idea that Trump will I'll address sort of two different backlash arguments for the last minute. First is the idea that Trump will attempt to backlash against any new restrictions placed on his authority. While this will be somewhat inevitable given that President Trump seems to like his executive authority, the problem is that he, at the end of the day, cannot simply clear the lines in the sand that are drawn by Congress. The only reason that he is able to do so right now is because of the fact that Congress has delegated far too much power to the executive. If the Congress is able to draw a clear line in the sand that the executive cannot transgress, then there is no legal justification for the executive branch to take, no matter how much it protests. Next, the argument about white nationalist backlash is inherently problematic, not only for the argument I made earlier about how allowing things like travel bans to remain in place feeds that very ideology, but also on principle is just incredibly in bad faith to simply refuse to take action simply because a group of bigoted people will lash out against us. It holds us hostage to people we should not be held hostage to and prevents us from taking the right course of moral action. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Parker Kelly. I'm super excited to be closing out this round and this fantastic tournament. Before I begin, like the 11 people before me, I'm going to go through some thank yous. Nate already thanked Paul Hayes for allowing us to come here, and Andrew Bowles and our own team, GWPDS, for supporting us along the way. I also just wanted to shout out the competitors for what has been a fantastic round and a fantastic tournament, and the audience for being so supportive, for being here in multiple different rounds. Additionally, thank you to the judges, to the moderator, to the timekeeper, not only in this round, but in every round. Y'all have run an amazing tournament here at JMU. Thank you also to the Arthur N. Root Foundation for making this such a special and interesting tournament. Thank you to my family for always supporting me through 6 years of debate at this point. And of course, thank you to Nate for being the best partner I could ever ask for. On that note, if everybody's ready. Before I delve into the biggest issues in this round, I want to address one argument that my partner Nate just gave us that I think is incredibly important. Even if it is true that this particular No Ban Act is something that is probably going to have good outcomes, this is insufficient because of the necessary spillover that is going to happen. Why does this happen? We gave you two reasons for this. First, that the plan devolves into mass confusion and stalled policy. As they told you themselves, there are a large number of planks that are given in this plan that make it difficult to know what to do at any given point in time. This either leads to more executive authority or having to over-edit what that law looks like and removing further and further what executive authority actually does exist. But also, we think that there's a precedent that is set by this particular action that leads to further restrictions. So even if this is supposed to be one small policy, it leads to dramatic negative outcomes on the executive oversight that happens. Then, I'd like to address the two ways that we've framed this round throughout. There is the one end and the negative bench discussion about prioritizing the choice of immigrants and maybe not bringing them to the United States, and then there's everything else caring about tangible oppression. We would argue that we ought to prioritize allowing people to have choice when they come to the United States, avoiding the paternalism that both sides have been accused of in this round by allowing for as much information as possible for one simple reason. Restoring choice for oppressed groups is probably the best thing we can do to allow the restoration of agency, to allow the restoration of status within a society, as structural violence always removes the ability to have freedom of choice, freedom of movement, and freedom generally. We also do think, though, it is valuable to look at the tangible oppression that the affirmative side in this round has claimed to be solving. With that said, let's talk about who deals with each of these best. First, the question of offering agency. We've been very clear. Their responses on the problems that exist, like a check on swings, don't actually look at the problems that we are solving. Namely, we offer as much information as possible when the executive can be explicitly clear about what they want their immigration policy to look like. When Barack Obama passes DACA, and this is a clear policy that tells immigrants now might be a better time to come to the United States, they know to act on that information. When Trump passes the travel ban, they know that the political winds have shifted the opposite direction, and they have more ability to make choices given that information. There is no possibility for that to be made given the complexity and the ever-changing nature and the need for continual congressional interpretation under the No Ban Act that side affirmative has given us in this particular round. This means that we always allow for the most oppressed groups to actually make choices. Rather than being paternalistic, side negative in this round is the most open to agency. But then, if we want to look at the actual tangible outcomes of this policy, why do we think our side is better? Certainly there are problems with executive authority, but it is a question of the comparative checks that exist. This is an issue that my partner raised in a question several speeches ago and has never been adequately addressed. So let's do some comparison. On the executive discretion that exists in the status quo, the courts can check absurd interpretations and bad laws. Congress rewrites and amend laws to remove bad interpretations. Agencies have bureaucrats with expertise and perceived independence from legislative politics as a check, and elections hold the president accountable, especially because only the president is considered responsible for immigration policies due to its national stature by every person who votes. But when it comes to Congress, these same checks don't exist. The courts can't check Congress for bad interpretation of the laws they write themselves. The president has no discretion and therefore cannot check the worst impulses of Congress. Agencies and their bureaucrats want or perceive the newly political nature and become more like yes men. And elections, no one blames their own representative for national issues, and incumbency bias protects them. Keep in mind also, as Nate tells you, this isn't just about Trump. Presidential actions have generally been good. DACA under Obama, amnesty under Reagan, and more things like that have always happened. We want to allow for executive authority so that we have the best impulses passed and the worst impulses checked. Only our side provides for that in this round. Thank you.
Congratulations to all of our competitors. At this time, the esteemed final round panel will enter into their jury deliberation.